October 19th, 1781, a field in Virginia. Two vast lines of soldiers, stretching for over a mile, stand motionless, bearing witness to the death of an empire. On one side of the road, the French Expedition Particulière, immaculate in their white coats and black gaiters. Their officers, aristocrats of an ancient regime, watch with a mixture of professional satisfaction and ancient rivalry. On the other side, their unlikely allies, the American Continental Army, a force forged in defeat and desperation, now standing rigid in their blue coats, a surprising discipline hammered into them by years of war. Between these two victorious lines, the unthinkable happens. A British army, arguably the finest field army on the planet, marches to surrender. The drums are sullen. The tune, according to tradition, is a pointedly relevant one. The world turned upside down. The British and German soldiers march with a grim, practiced formality. Their red coats are worn, their faces gaunt, but their discipline holds. They are under strict orders to march with their flags cased and furled, a profound military humiliation. At the head of the column rides not the man responsible, but his substitute. Lieutenant General Charles, Lord Cornwallis, the British field commander in the south, has feigned illness. He remains in the shattered, cannon-blasted town of Yorktown, unable to face the professional disgrace of this moment. In his place, he has sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. O'Hara, representing the Crown, first approaches the French commander, Lieutenant General Comte de Rochambeau. He attempts to offer him his sword, an insult to the Americans, implying the British were defeated by a real European army, not a colonial rabble. The grizzled French professional simply shakes his head and gestures toward the American commander-in-chief. O'Hara wheels his horse and presents himself to General George Washington. Washington, a man obsessed with protocol and propriety, refuses the sword. He knows it is not the act of a commanding general, but of a deputy. He gestures to his own second-in-command. Major General Benjamin Lincoln, the very man who had been forced to surrender his own American army to the British in Charleston a year prior, is instructed to step forward. It is Lincoln who accepts the token of submission from O'Hara. The sword is received, and the ceremony is complete. One by one, the British regiments, the Foot Guards, the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers, the 33rd Regiment of Foot, the 71st Highlanders, march into a designated field and begin to throw down their arms. The war is not formally over, but everyone here knows this is the end. This is the day Britain lost America. This catastrophic surrender, the final nail in the coffin of British rule, was not the result of a single pitched battle. It was the result of a flawless strategic trap, a masterpiece of combined operations, and a fatal miscalculation. It began just 2.5 months earlier, on August 1st, 1781. On that day, Lord Cornwallis marched his army into the small tobacco port of Yorktown, Virginia. He was not seeking a fight. He was seeking a lifeline. He had chosen Yorktown for one reason. It was a deep water port. His army, exhausted from a punishing campaign in the Carolinas, needed resupply. He needed a secure base where he could be reinforced or, if necessary, evacuated by the Royal Navy. The entire British strategy in America rested on the unshakable belief that the Royal Navy owned the seas. Yorktown itself was a poor choice. The brief described it perfectly, a cul-de-sac. It sat on a high bluff, some 40 feet over the York River, but it was hemmed in by marshy creeks and the wide river itself. Without naval control, it was a death trap. But Cornwallis, confident in his fleet, ordered his 8,900 men, a mix of British regulars, loyalist provincials, and German auxiliaries from Hesse and Ansbach-Bayreuth, to begin digging. They built a series of earthen redoubts, angled fortifications, and batteries. They were digging, though they did not know it, their own graves. While they dug, the gears of a vast international machine were beginning to turn, hundreds of miles away. Hundreds of miles to the north near New York City, General George Washington faced a grim reality. For years, his primary objective had been to attack the main British bastion at New York, a fortress held by the overall British commander, Sir Henry Clinton. But his Continental Army, though hardened, was weary. He lacked the manpower and, crucially, the naval power to attempt such a siege. His ally, the Comte de Rochambeau, commanding 7,800 French regulars, was a realist. He knew an assault on New York was folly. The war was in danger of becoming a stalemate, a bleeding ulcer that Parliament might just decide to endure. They needed a decisive, war-ending victory, and they needed it now. The entire character of the war changed in mid-August 1781. A dispatch rider arrived at Washington's headquarters with the most important message of the Revolution. It was from Lieutenant General Comte de Grasse, the admiral of the French West Indies fleet. De Grasse was sailing north, not for New York, but for the Chesapeake Bay. He was bringing his entire fleet of 28 ships of the line, packed with 20,000 sailors and 3,000 Marines. And he would only be available for a limited time. The clock was ticking. Suddenly, the focus of the war snapped from New York to Virginia. Washington, in a masterstroke of strategic audacity, saw the opportunity. Cornwallis, who had fortified himself at Yorktown, was the target. The trap was set. Washington and Rochambeau immediately put their armies in motion. The operation required almost perfect secrecy and timing. They left a phantom force behind to deceive Clinton in New York, setting up fake encampments and bread ovens to suggest a long siege was imminent. Then, on August 19th, the combined Allied army, some 8,800 Americans and 7,800 French, began to move. This was the Great March South, a logistical miracle over 400 miles long. The French, with their vast baggage train and siege artillery, were a spectacle. The Americans, in their dusty blue coats, marched with a new sense of purpose. They finally had a tangible objective. While the land forces were still marching, the first jaw of the vice snapped shut. On August 30th, 1781, the skyline at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay filled with a forest of masts. Admiral de Grasse and his 28 ships of the line had arrived. His massive 104-gun flagship, the Ville de Paris, was one of the most powerful warships in the world. The French fleet fanned out, establishing an impenetrable blockade. Cornwallis's deep water port was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The 8,900 men inside Yorktown were cut off from the sea. Their reaction was one of disbelief, which quickly curdled into anxiety. They scanned the horizon, not for the French, but for their own deliverance. That deliverance was on its way, but it was late. In New York, Rear Admiral Thomas Graves, commander of the British fleet, had finally pieced together the Allied plan. He gathered his 19 ships of the line and sailed south in a desperate attempt to force the Chesapeake, break the blockade, and relieve Cornwallis. Everything now depended on a naval engagement. The fate of the 8,900 men at Yorktown, and indeed the entire war, would be decided not by soldiers on land, but by sailors and cannons at sea. The two great fleets, the pride of France and Britain, were on a collision course. On September 5th, 1781, lookouts on de Grasse's ships spotted Graves's fleet approaching. The French, in a hurried but professional maneuver, slipped their anchor cables and sailed out to meet the British in open water. The Battle of the Chesapeake was about to begin. The afternoon of September 5th, 1781, was clear. The wind was favourable. Two of the most powerful fleets on Earth manoeuvred for the weather gauge, the critical upwind position that would allow them to dictate the engagement. Admiral Graves, commanding the 19 ships of the British line, was a competent but perhaps uninspired commander. He was outnumbered, but the Royal Navy had a long and glorious tradition of winning against the odds. Admiral de Grasse, with 28 ships of the line, had a different objective. He did not need to destroy the British fleet, he merely had to stop them. He needed to hold the mouth of the Chesapeake. The battle lines, miles-long columns of wooden fortresses, slowly converged. The signal flags snapped in the wind, and the first cannons roared. The engagement was a classic 18th century naval slugfest. The ships sailed past each other on opposite tacks, their gun crews working in a frantic, smoky hell of sweat, gunpowder, and splintered wood. firing broadside after broadside. The heavy 24 and 36-pounder cannonballs smashed hulls, toppled masts, and scythed through the packed gun decks. The British, in particular, suffered. Their lead ships took the brunt of the French fire. Masts cracked, rigging was torn to ribbons, and several ships were left crippled, unable to maneuver. The fighting lasted for hours, a chaotic and thunderous affair, until the fleets drifted apart in the fading light. Tactically, the battle was almost a draw. No ships were sunk or captured on either side. But strategically, it was one of the most decisive victories in history. De Grasse had achieved his objective. He still held the bay. Admiral Graves, on the other hand, had failed. His fleet was battered. His ships were taking on water, their masts splintered. For several agonizing days, he lingered offshore, his lookouts watching the unbroken line of French ships. He was faced with an impossible choice: risk his entire fleet in a desperate, outnumbered second attack, or retreat. On September 13th, Graves gave the order. The British fleet, the only hope for Lord Cornwallis, turned north and limped back to New York for repairs. The last chance of rescue was gone. The naval blockade was now absolute. Inside Yorktown, the British and German soldiers heard the distant thunder of the cannons and prayed for deliverance. When the seas grew quiet and the horizon remained empty of British sails, a cold dread began to set in. They were alone. As the naval noose tightened, the landward arm of the pincer was closing. The great march south was complete. Between September 14th and 24th, the dusty, sweating columns of Washington's Continentals and Rochambeau's French regulars arrived in the Virginia tidewater. They marched into the camps near Williamsburg, joining the American Light Infantry Division already on the scene. This force was commanded by the young, passionate and energetic Major General Marquis de Lafayette, who had been skillfully shadowing and containing Cornwallis for weeks, preventing him from breaking out and marching south into the Carolinas. The arrival of the main armies was a moment of profound relief for Lafayette and a spectacle for all. The Allied force was now an overwhelming host. Nearly 19,000 soldiers, over 20,000 if one included de Grasse's Marines, were now assembled against Cornwallis's 8,900. The trap was sprung. On September 28th, the combined Allied army broke camp and began the formal investment of Yorktown. They marched in two great columns, fanning out, pushing back the British pickets. They advanced to within a mile of the British lines, encircling the town by land. The British watched from their earthen walls, as the fields before them filled with enemy soldiers, tents, and flags. The siege of Yorktown had officially begun. Inside the earthen walls of Yorktown, Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis was a realist. He was an experienced, aggressive field commander, but he was now forced into a static, defensive battle he loathed. He was outnumbered more than 2-1. His lifeline to the sea was severed. His fortifications, built in haste, were not the mighty stone ramparts of a European fortress. They were mounds of earth, timber, and sand, designed to ward off a quick assault, not withstand a formal European-style siege by a massive, well-equipped army. His first line of defense was a series of outer redoubts and batteries, advanced positions designed to keep the enemy artillery at a distance. These were his eyes and his first shield, but as the thousands of Allied troops fanned out, their numbers became depressingly clear. Cornwallis looked at his thin line of 8,900 men and looked at the 19,000 investing him. He believed his outer works were too exposed, too vulnerable to being stormed and cut off. He made a decision. On the night of September 30th, 1781, just 2 days into the siege, Cornwallis gave a fateful order: abandon the outer line. He commanded his men to pull back to the main, inner fortifications around the town itself. It was a critical, unforced error. He was ceding the high ground. He was, in effect, inviting the enemy to bring their heaviest guns in close. The Allied commanders, Washington and Rochambeau, were stunned by their good fortune. They had expected a bloody fight for that ground. Instead, as the brief states, They simply occupied it. This blunder dramatically accelerated the Allied timeline. The methodical 18th century science of siegecraft could now begin. This was not a war of dashing charges, but a war of engineering, mathematics, and back-breaking labour. The architect of this phase was the French Engineering Corps, masters of the Vauban-style siege. On the night of October 6, 1781, thousands of Allied soldiers, their movements masked by darkness and a steady, harassing fire from their field guns, moved forward. They carried picks, shovels, and gabions, large wicker baskets to be filled with earth. They began to dig. All night long, they worked in terrifying proximity to the British lines, protected by covering parties of infantry. They were digging the first siege parallel, a massive trench, 2,000 yards long, stretching across the entire front of Yorktown, just 600 to 800 yards from the British cannons. Connected to this main trench were the zigzagging saps, the approach trenches that allowed men and equipment to move forward without being exposed to direct fire. By dawn, the British on the ramparts were shocked to see a long, fresh scar of raw earth facing them. The first line of strangulation was complete. Now, the real work began. For 3 days, soldiers dragged the heavy guns into place. This was the decisive weapon, the Allied siege artillery. The French, in particular, had brought a massive siege train. These were not the light 6-pounder field guns used by the infantry. These were the monsters, massive 18 and 24-pounder cannons, whose solid iron roundshot could pulverize earthen ramparts, and heavy mortars, designed to lob exploding shells in a high arc, dropping death and terror directly inside the British lines. The Allies had over 100 such guns, far outnumbering the British defenders. They were manhandled into carefully constructed batteries, wooden and earthen platforms, designed to withstand the recoil of the guns and protect the crews. At 3 p.m. on October 9, 1781, all was ready. The French were the first to open fire, their heavy batteries unleashing a salvo. 2 hours later, the American batteries, including one commanded by Washington himself, who reputedly touched off the first cannon, joined the chorus. The bombardment had begun. The brief describes the sensory experience as incessant, deafening, and terrible. It was a constant rolling thunder that never stopped, day or night. The massive iron balls slammed into the British defences, smashing cannons, splintering wooden palisades, and collapsing the parapets. The mortar shells, described by one soldier as crossing each other in the air, like meteors, arced over the walls, exploding inside the crowded town. Soldiers, civilians, and horses were torn apart. Yorktown had become a hell. The British guns, though bravely served, were dismounted one by one. The earthen walls, the only thing protecting Cornwallis's army, were visibly melting away under the relentless iron storm. For 2 days, the Allied guns hammered the British. The town of Yorktown was disintegrating. Houses were reduced to kindling, and the streets were ploughed by roundshot. The British lines, as described in the brief, were becoming a mangled mess. Inside this cauldron, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Disease, smallpox and dysentery spread through the crowded, filthy encampments. The constant deafening roar of the guns and the whine of incoming mortar shells shattered nerves. The British were trapped in rubble, with no way to repair the damage as fast as it was being inflicted. Their own return fire slackened as their guns were dismounted and their ammunition began to run low. But for the Allies, it still wasn't enough. General Washington and the French engineers were following the precise, bloody textbook of 18th century siege warfare. The first parallel had been a success, but its purpose was to provide a secure platform to begin the next step. To truly break the British, they had to get closer. They needed to establish a new trench, a second siege parallel, within easy musket range of the main British line. The brief specifies the distance, a terrifying 400 yards. At this range, not only could the heavy cannons be used as surgical battering rams, but the infantry themselves could begin to suppress any defender who dared show his head. On the night of October 11th, 1781, the digging began again. This was infinitely more dangerous work than the first trench. At 400 yards, the diggers were vulnerable to grapeshot and canister from British field guns, and to musket balls from the infantry on the ramparts. The work was slow, terrifying, and done in total darkness. But as the trench snaked its way across the battlefield, the Allied engineers ran into a critical physical obstacle. Their new line could not be completed. It could not extend to the York River and completely envelop the British, because two specific British fortifications stood in the way. They were known as Redoubt No. 9 and Redoubt Yorktown. These were not part of the main British line, but advanced earthen forts, pushed out from the primary defences. They were angled, ditched, and protected by sharpened wooden stakes called abatis. They were manned by British and German infantry, and their cannons were perfectly placed to pour a murderous flanking fire, an enfilade, down the line of any new trench the Allies tried to dig. They were the linchpins of the British defence on this side of the line. Washington and Rochambeau were unanimous in their decision. The redoubts had to be taken, and they could not be taken by the slow work of cannons. They had to be taken by storm. The plan was for a simultaneous surprise night attack, a pure infantry action of shock and steel. The date was set for the night of October 14th. The assault would be a joint operation, a symbol of the Allied partnership. The French, under the overall command of Baron de Viomeny, were given the task of taking Redoubt No. 9, the larger and more heavily defended of the two. The specific unit chosen was the Royal Deux Ponts Regiment, led by Colonel Wilhelm von Zweibrücken. The Americans, under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, were assigned Redoubt Darmstadt, which was smaller but perched perilously close to the riverbank. The man chosen to lead the 400-man American assault column was a young, ambitious, and brilliant staff officer who had been begging Washington for a field command, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. The orders for the attack were brutal and specific. This was not to be a firefight. The brief highlights the key tactic. The American soldiers were to advance with unloaded muskets. This was a shocking but brilliant command. It ensured surprise, as a nervous soldier couldn't fire his musket prematurely and alert the garrison. It ensured speed, as the men would not be tempted to stop, take cover, and reload, which would break the assault's momentum. This was to be a pure, cold steel bayonet charge. Speed, shock, and ruthless aggression were the only things that would see them through. As darkness fell on October 14th, Hamilton's and Zweibrücken's men filed into the forward trenches, fixed their bayonets, and waited in silent, agonizing tension for the signal to attack. At 8:00 p.m. on October 14th, 1781, 6 signal shells were fired into the night sky. The streaks of light arced over the battlefield, and in that instant, the tension broke. From the forward trenches, the assault columns surged into the darkness. This was a race. It was a race against the British defenders realizing what was happening, a race against the main British line opening up with canister and grapeshot, and, for the Americans and French, a point of national honor. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, leading his 400 Americans, sprinted at the head of his column directly toward Redoubt Darmstadt. His men were silent, their muskets empty as ordered, their bayonets gleaming in the starlight. They were running over open ground, a killing field. The British defenders, suddenly aware of the dark mass rushing toward them, opened fire. Muskets flashed from the parapet, tearing gaps in the American line. But the attackers did not stop. They did not slow to fire back. They had one objective. They crashed into the first line of defense, the abatis, a dense barrier of sharpened trees. While Hamilton's main body was momentarily checked, a contingent of sappers, men with axes, hacked frantically at the wooden stakes under a hail of fire. Hamilton, impatient and fiery, reportedly climbed onto the back of one of his soldiers, scrambled over the abatis, and was one of the first men into the deep, dry ditch that surrounded the redoubt. The soldiers followed, clawing their way up the 9-foot earthen wall, stabbing their bayonets into the packed earth to use as footholds. They poured over the parapet in a wave, landing inside the redoubt. The fight was a brutal, shadowy melee of bayonets and musket butts. It was over in less than 10 minutes. The British infantry, overwhelmed by the sheer speed and ferocity of the bayonet-only assault, were killed, captured, or fled back to their main lines. Hamilton's men had taken the redoubt, a stunning and bloody victory. Simultaneously, a few hundred yards away, the French assault on Redoubt No. 9 began. Theirs was the harder task. Redoubt No. 9 was larger, better fortified, and manned by a stronger garrison of 120 British and Hessian troops. Colonel Wilhelm von Zweibrücken led his 400 men of the Royal Dupont Regiment forward. They too advanced in silence, but were met by a devastating volley of Hessian musketry. The French column staggered. Unlike the Americans, they had not waited to clear the abatis. They had hacked their way through, a process that cost them precious minutes and many lives under fire. For a moment, the assault faltered. But the French officers, aristocrats trained for this exact moment, led from the front. They pressed their men forward into the ditch and up the scarred walls. The fight inside Redoubt No. 9 was longer and far bloodier than at Thapaten. The Hessians and British, fighting for their lives, resisted fiercely. It was a 30-minute slaughterhouse, but the French, with their professional discipline and overwhelming numbers, were relentless. They secured the fortification. The cost, however, was high. The French suffered nearly 100 casualties in the attack, compared to Hamilton's 40. But they had won. The celebration was immediate. As soon as the redoubts were secure, Allied soldiers flooded into them, not with bayonets, but with picks and shovels. The brief states that this was the decisive tactical action of the siege, and its importance was immediate. The capture of redoubts No. 9 and No. 10 allowed the Allied engineers to complete the second siege parallel. The trench line was extended all the way to the York River. The noose was now complete, but more importantly, the Allies immediately began constructing new, heavy artillery batteries inside the captured redoubts. The British had built these forts to protect their own lines. Now, they would serve as the platforms to destroy them. By morning, Cornwallis could see French and American flags flying from his former defences, and he could see the muzzles of their heaviest cannons, now less than 400 yards away, aimed directly at his last line of defence. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. The dawn of October 15th, 1781, revealed the full extent of the disaster to the British. The Allied flags on redoubts Notre 9 and Notre 10 were not just symbols of defeat, they were markers for a new and terrible phase of the siege. Throughout the night, Allied engineers and sappers had worked with frantic energy, connecting the captured redoubts to their second siege parallel. The line was now complete, a 400-yard scar of death that hemmed in the British from river to river. Worse, the engineers were already building new, heavy gun platforms inside the captured forts. The Allies had, in effect, turned Cornwallis's own defences against him. Within hours, the new batteries were operational. The brief, terrifying bombardment of the previous days was about to be eclipsed. Now, the heaviest guns of the Allied siege train, the massive French 18 and 24-pounders, were at point-blank range. This was no longer just bombardment, it was surgical destruction. The Allied gunners could now see their individual targets. They no longer aimed at the town of Yorktown. They aimed at specific cannons on the British ramparts. The Allied fire was overwhelming. The British were hopelessly outgunned, with over 100 Allied siege pieces firing day and night from this new, unassailable position. The sensory details, as recorded in diaries, are apocalyptic. The sound was incessant and deafening. It was a physical concussion that never stopped, a constant vibration that one could feel in the chest. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, a sulphurous, acrid fog that burned the eyes and throat. The sky, even at night, was lit by the terrible and meteoric arcs of mortar shells, which exploded with devastating effect inside the British lines. The round shot from the 24-pounder cannons, fired from only 400 yards, did not just bounce off the British earthworks. They smashed through them. As the brief notes, the British lines became a mangled mess. Earthen walls collapsed, trenches caved in, and the carefully placed British artillery was dismounted, its wooden carriages blown to splinters, the cannons themselves tossed aside like toys. For the British and German soldiers huddled behind these disintegrating mounds of earth, it was an existence of pure, unadulterated terror. There was no safety. A soldier in the 71st Regiment of Foot, Fraser's Highlanders, or the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, was just as likely to be killed by an exploding shell while trying to sleep as he was by a musket ball on the firing step. The town itself, as the brief states, was rubble. No building was safe. Cornwallis himself had been forced to move his headquarters into a cave-like shelter dug into the high bluff overlooking the river. The physical toll was matched by the logistical one. The brief confirms the dire situation. Ammunition was critically low. The British gunners, even if their guns were intact, could barely fire back. Food, already scarce, was now on reduced rations. And disease, the inevitable companion of any 18th century siege, was rampant. Smallpox and dysentery, what was then called bloody flux, were racing through the ranks, killing men more quietly, but just as surely, as the French cannons. Cornwallis, a proud and aggressive commander, was now reduced to the role of a passive observer, watching his army be systematically, scientifically, and relentlessly ground into dust. He had to do something. Any action, even a hopeless one, was preferable to this passive annihilation. Lord Cornwallis was now a general with no options. His fortifications were breached, his guns were silent, his men were sick and starving, and the Allied artillery was now firing at point-blank range. To do nothing was to wait for an inevitable, bloody, final assault. He had to try something, anything. On October 16th, he authorized two last desperate gambles. The first was a classic military tactic, a sortie. This was not an attempt to break the siege. That was impossible. This was a targeted commando raid, a mission of sabotage. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 16th, a hand-picked force of 350 British soldiers, composed of elite light infantry and men from the foot guards, slipped out of their ruined defences. Their target was the newly completed Allied second parallel, specifically the American and French batteries that were tearing their lines apart. Their mission, as the brief states, was to spike the Allied guns. This was a brutal, intimate task. The soldiers, armed with bayonets and heavy hammers, were to storm the gun positions, overwhelm the crews, and drive long, hardened steel spikes into the touch holes of the heavy cannons, thus rendering them inoperable. It was a mission to buy time, to silence the guns for a few precious days. The raid was swift and momentarily successful. They stormed a French battery and an American one, surprising the gun crews. A frantic, shadowy fight erupted in the trenches. The British raiders, with desperate courage, reached several cannons and hammered their spikes home. But the Allied response was immediate. French and American infantry, stationed nearby for just such an event, counterattacked with overwhelming force. The British party was driven back, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The entire action was over in minutes. It had been a brave, but ultimately futile gesture. By the time the sun rose, Allied engineers had already drilled out the spikes or simply re-drilled new touch holes. Within hours, the guns were firing again. The sortie, as the brief confirms, had failed. That same night, Cornwallis put his final, most desperate plan into action. If he could not fight his way out by land, he would try to escape by water. Not to the sea, that was blocked by de Grasse's 28 ships of the line, but across the York River. The far bank at Gloucester Point was more lightly invested. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. He would ferry his entire combat-effective force across the mile-wide river in a fleet of small boats. He would abandon his heavy equipment, his baggage, and most horrifyingly, his sick and wounded. Once across, this mobile strike force would try to break through the Allied lines at Gloucester and begin a desperate 900-mile march north to New York. As darkness fell on October 16th, the operation began. The first wave of boats, packed with the Army's best troops, the Foot Guards, the 33rd, the 23rd, pushed off from the shattered wharves of Yorktown. They rowed with muffled oars, a ghost army attempting to slip away in the night. The fate of the war hung in the balance, resting on the calm of the river and the darkness of the sky. Then, as the first boats reached the middle of the river, fate intervened. The weather, which had been still, turned. A violent squall, as the brief describes it, suddenly descended upon the river. The wind howled, and the rain began to lash down in horizontal sheets. The wide York River, a calm estuary moments before, was churned into a dangerous chop. The small, overloaded transport boats were tossed, swamped, and scattered. Control was impossible. The brief is stark. The squall scatters his boats. The mission was torn apart not by enemy action, but by the elements. The evacuation was a catastrophic failure. All night, the boats struggled back to the Yorktown shore, battered and half sunk. The exhausted troops, soaked to the bone and freezing, disembarked onto the same ground they had tried to flee. This, as the brief notes, was the final, devastating blow to morale. There was no escape. The trap was final. Dawn on October 17th, 1781, broke over a scene of utter desolation. The squall had passed, leaving a cold, miserable rain. The British and German soldiers who had struggled back from the failed river evacuation were soaked, freezing, and utterly broken in spirit. They crawled back into their mangled trenches, which were now slick with mud and choked with the dead and dying. The brief is clear. This was the final devastating blow to morale. There was no hope. There was no escape. The Royal Navy was not coming. The army could not fight its way out. It could not even run. As the morning light strengthened, the Allied bombardment, which had briefly slackened during the storm, resumed with a vengeful, methodical fury. The new batteries on the second parallel, some as close as 400 yards, opened up again. The round shot tore through the last of the British defences, and the mortar shells rained down on the huddled, exposed infantry. Inside his headquarters, likely the cave dug into the river bluff, Lord Cornwallis held a council of war with his officers. The situation was plain. Ammunition was almost gone. Food was gone. The hospitals were overflowing. Disease was rampant. The fortifications were, as the brief states, rubble. To continue the fight was not an act of bravery, it would be an act of mass murder. A professional 18th century general had a duty to his men. When all hope of victory or relief was gone, his duty was to surrender and save their lives. Cornwallis, a proud man who had carved a swath of victory through the American South, now had to accept the single greatest military humiliation of his career. He wrote a short note. He folded it. He gave the order. At approximately 10 a.m., the Allied gunners in the French and American batteries were preparing their next salvos. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air. It was not the boom of a cannon or the crack of a musket. It was a drum. The Allied soldiers, peering through the acrid gunpowder smoke, saw a figure emerge onto a shattered section of the British parapet. The brief identifies him clearly. A British drummer boy. He was likely a teenager, anonymous to history, but at this moment, the most important man on the field. He was frantically beating a rhythm. He was beating the parley. This was the signal, respected by all European armies, to request a parley, to talk. The Allied guns fell silent. The incessant, deafening roar that had tortured the men of both armies for 9 straight days stopped. The sudden, profound silence was shocking. Next to the drummer boy, a British officer appeared, holding a white handkerchief tied to the end of a sword. The war, for this moment, stopped. The officer was blindfolded, a standard procedure, and led through the maze of Allied trenches, past the smoking cannons and the files of curious American and French infantry. He was taken to a forward command post, and the note was hurried to General George Washington. Washington, The stoic Virginia planter who had held the Continental Army together for 6 long years through starvation, mutiny, and defeat, read the words he had been waiting for. Lord Cornwallis proposed a cessation of hostilities and a meeting of officers to negotiate the terms of surrender. Washington's terms were swift and harsh. He was not going to give Cornwallis time. He replied that he would grant the British 2 hours to submit their formal written proposals. There would be no lengthy negotiation. This was to be an unconditional capitulation. The guns remained silent. The trap, sealed by de Grasse's fleet and sprung by the Allied armies, had finally crushed its victim. The process of surrender had begun. The 2 hours granted by General Washington were a formality. Lord Cornwallis had no room to negotiate. He was not a defeated rival. He was a trapped animal. His army of 8,900 men was starving, sick, and surrounded by nearly 20,000 Allied troops and over 100 heavy siege guns. Any proposals he sent back were essentially a plea for terms. Washington, in consultation with his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, was in a position of absolute power, and he intended to use it. The negotiations that followed on October 18th were brief and brutal. The terms were drafted by the Allied command, and they were a direct and pointed act of retribution. General Washington had a long memory. Just 1 year earlier, in 1780, the British had captured the American Southern Army at Charleston. The British commander on that day had imposed the harshest, most humiliating terms possible on the defeated Americans, refusing them the traditional honors of war. The American commander forced to endure that disgrace was Major General Benjamin Lincoln. Now, Washington had the chance to return the favor. The terms dictated to Cornwallis were, point for point, the same humiliating terms from Charleston. The British Army would not be granted the honors of war. This was not a negotiation between equals. It was the processing of a prisoner. The British and German soldiers would march out of their defenses, but their regimental flags and colours, the sacred symbols of their honour, were to be cased and furled. They would not be allowed to fly. Their bands, by tradition, would have played a tune of the victor, a French or American march, as a sign of respect. This too was forbidden. They were permitted only to play a British or German tune. The legend, as noted in the brief, holds that they chose "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting and bitter epitaph for their empire in America. Perhaps the most personal and pointed article of all was the one concerning the ceremony itself. Lord Cornwallis was to formally surrender his sword, the ultimate symbol of his authority and his defeat, to the Allied Commander-in-Chief. The entire captured army, the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the proud Foot Guards, the 33rd Regiment, the 71st Highlanders, and their German comrades, would then march between 2 long lines of the victorious Allies, 1 French, 1 American. They would proceed to a designated field, a surrender field, and there, man by man, they would lay down their arms. Lord Cornwallis, trapped in his ruined headquarters, read the articles of capitulation. They were a professional soldier's worst nightmare, but he had no choice. His army was destroyed. To refuse would be to condemn his remaining men to a final, pointless slaughter. On the morning of October 19, 1781, the document was signed. The orders were issued. Inside the British lines, soldiers, in a fit of rage and despair, began to smash their muskets, known as the Brown Bess, rather than hand them over intact. Officers were seen weeping. In the Allied lines, there was a quiet, almost stunned sense of triumph. The impossible had been achieved. Washington, ever the master of symbolic gestures, gave his final order for the ceremony. He would be there to preside, but the man he designated to formally receive the British sword was his own second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln. The man who had been forced to surrender at Charleston would be the man to accept the surrender at Yorktown. The poetic justice was complete. The stage was set. The Allied armies marched from their siege lines, fixed their bayonets, and formed the 2 long, silent lines of judgment on the Hampton Road. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, October 19th, 1781. The air was still. The Hampton Road, which led out of the shattered remains of Yorktown, had become a corridor of judgment. On the west side of the road, the French army stood, a mile-long line of immaculate white wool uniforms, gleaming muskets, and aristocratic officers. These were the men of the Expedition Particulière, the professional heart of the siege. Facing them, on the east side of the road, stood the American Continental Army. They were a stark contrast. Their blue coats were faded and worn, their equipment a motley collection from captured British stores or French aid. But they stood with a new, hardened discipline, a professional pride earned in the mud and blood of the trenches. They were the men who had just stormed Redoubt Neuchâtel. From the British lines, the sound of drumming emerged, a slow, sombre, sullen beat. The gates of the fortress opened, and the defeated army began its final march. The procession was led by Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. As the brief makes clear, the man who was truly responsible, Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis, was absent. Claiming to be sick, he remained in his quarters, unable to personally endure the disgrace. He had delegated the ultimate humiliation to his second-in-command. O'Hara rode at the head of the column, a proud professional Irish soldier, forced to perform this agonizing ritual. Behind him marched the survivors of his army. The brief notes their identity: the composite battalion of elite foot guards, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the 23rd Foot, Cornwallis's own 33rd Regiment, the kilted 71st Fraser's Highlanders, and the green-jacketed British Legion of Banastre Tarleton. With them marched their German allies, the Hessians and Ansbach-Bayreuth regiments. As per the articles of capitulation, their regimental flags, the symbols of their honour, which they had carried through victorious battles across the Carolinas, were cased and furled. The brief confirms the legend. Their bands played the hauntingly appropriate tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." It was the soundtrack to the end of an era. O'Hara rode down the long, silent corridor of victors. He first reined in his horse and approached the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, who sat mounted with his staff. In a final pointed gesture of contempt for the Americans, O'Hara attempted to surrender his sword, Cornwallis's sword, to Rochambeau. He was surrendering to a real European army, not a colonial militia. The Comte de Rochambeau, a grizzled and consummate professional, simply looked at O'Hara and gave a slight shake of his head. He gestured across the road. He would not accept the sword. The true commander of this allied army, he indicated, was the American general. O'Hara, his face flushed with the rebuke, wheeled his horse and trotted across the road to where General George Washington sat, immovable as a statue, on his own horse. O'Hara presented himself, offering the sword of Cornwallis. Washington, a man obsessed with protocol, looked not at O'Hara, but at the sword. He knew this was an act for a subordinate, not a commander. Cornwallis had sent his second. Washington would answer with his. He refused to accept the sword himself. Instead, he gestured to his own second-in-command, who sat mounted nearby, Major General Benjamin Lincoln. The brief highlights the stunning poetic justice of this moment. It was Lincoln who had been forced to surrender his entire American army to the British at Charleston in 1780, enduring the full humiliation of their harsh terms. Now, Washington gave Lincoln the honor of receiving the enemy's submission. Lincoln, a large, solemn man, moved his horse forward and took the sword from O'Hara. The transfer was brief. The ceremony, the core act of surrender, was complete. The ultimate symbol of British military power in the South had been handed over. The column of defeated soldiers marched on, past the watching eyes of their victors, to a field beyond. There, they were ordered to form a circle and lay down their weapons, regiment by regiment. The war was, in effect, over. The surrender at Yorktown was not a simple defeat in a single battle. It was the catastrophic failure of an entire global strategy. It was the second time in just 4 years that a complete British field army had been captured whole. The first being General Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in 1777. But this was worse. This was an army under Britain's most celebrated field commander, Lord Cornwallis, annihilated on the coast in what was supposed to be a secure naval bastion. The question that echoed from the surrender field all the way to a stunned Parliament in London was, how could this have happened? The answer lies in a combination of fatal British miscalculation and a brilliant, complex, and perfectly executed Allied plan. The brief is clear. This was a masterpiece of combined arms and joint international operations. The defeat began with Lord Cornwallis's own strategic choice. He had selected Yorktown precisely because it was a deep-water port, a place where the Royal Navy, his lifeline, could resupply or evacuate him. The entire British war effort in America rested on the unchallenged supremacy of its fleet. Yorktown, as the brief describes it, was a cul-de-sac. With naval control, it was a fortress. Without it, it was a death trap. Cornwallis, in August 1781, had willingly marched his 8,900 men into a cage and handed the key to the Royal Navy. That key was snatched away on September 5th, 1781. The brief correctly identifies the Battle of the Chesapeake as the single most important action of the campaign. When Admiral de Grasse's 28 French ships of the line met Admiral Graves's 19 British ships, the war was not decided by soldiers, but by sailors. The French victory, though tactically minor, was strategically absolute. It sealed the bay. It turned Cornwallis's fortress into a prison. The British fleet, defeated and battered, limped back to New York, and with it sailed every last hope of British victory in America. With the first jaw of the trap, the naval blockade, snapped shut, the second jaw closed. This was the land component, a masterpiece of its own. General George Washington and his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, had executed a flawless 400-mile march from the New York area. They had deceived the main British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, into believing New York was the target, then moved with lightning speed to Virginia. When their 19,000 men joined with Lafayette's division, the landward envelopment was complete. Cornwallis was now outnumbered more than 2-1, with no escape. At this point, the battle became one of 18th century science. The brief highlights that this was a victory of Vauban-style siegecraft. It was a methodical, mathematical, and relentless process of strangulation. Cornwallis made this process easier. On September 30th, he committed a critical error, abandoning his outer redoubts. The Allies simply occupied them, allowing them to begin their first siege parallel at a shockingly close range. From there, it was a war of engineering. The French siege train was the decisive weapon. The 18 and 24-pounder cannons and heavy mortars, over 100 in all, were weapons the British could not match. They systematically pulverized the British earthen defences. The final tactical stroke was the bayonet assault on redoubts Nacre 9 and Nacre 10. The brief rightly calls this the decisive tactical action, and it was a perfect example of Allied cooperation. The French Royal Dupont stormed Nacre 9. Alexander Hamilton's Americans, with unloaded muskets, stormed Nacre 10. The capture of these forts allowed the Allies to build their second parallel, just 400 yards from the British line. From here, the heavy guns were no longer bombarding, they were executing. The British lines, as described, became a mangled mess. The failed British sortie and the disastrous storm-wrecked evacuation attempt were the last twitches of a dying army. Every element, naval, land, engineering, and even the weather, had combined against them. The trap was perfect. The news of Yorktown did not reach London for over a month. When it finally arrived on November 25th, 1781, it was a political explosion. The brief states that the surrender shattered the political will in London for continued offensive operations. This is an understatement. The news was a death blow to the government of Lord North, which had prosecuted the war for 6 long years. When Lord North himself received the dispatch, he reportedly staggered as if shot, throwing his arms in the air and exclaiming, "Oh God, it is all over." It was. The war in America had always been deeply divisive in Parliament. Now its chief proponent had lost not one, but 2 entire field armies to the colonial rebels. The staggering cost in blood, treasure, and now national pride was indefensible. The opposition in Parliament seized the moment. The British war effort, which had once been a matter of imperial policing, had now drawn in Britain's ancient enemies, France and Spain. The nation was diplomatically isolated. Fighting a global war it was now visibly losing. The surrender of Cornwallis, the kingdom's ablest general, proved that there was no military path to victory. The will to fight was gone. In March 1782, just 5 months after the surrender, Lord North's government collapsed. He resigned, and a new government, a peace government, was formed. Their mandate from a war-weary parliament and public was simple: end this catastrophic war. They immediately dispatched negotiators to France to open peace talks with the American, French, and Spanish representatives. The war on the American continent effectively ground to a halt. While minor skirmishes would continue, the British Army, now consolidated in New York, Charleston, and Savannah, was given a new defensive posture. They were no longer trying to conquer America. They were holding on, waiting for the diplomats to finalize the terms of their exit. The formal end, as the brief notes, would not come until the Oaks Treaty of Paris in 1783. This document formally recognized the independence, sovereignty, and existence of the United States of America. Britain had not just lost a war, it had lost its most valuable colony. It had lost the entire Western Hemisphere of its empire, a vast, resource-rich continent. The world had truly been turned upside down. The greatest imperial power on earth had been defeated by a popular insurgency, bankrolled and armed by its oldest rival. The impact on the British Empire was profound. This defeat marked the end of the First British Empire and would force a dramatic strategic pivot. Stripped of its American colonies, Britain would turn its imperial ambitions eastward, to India, to Asia, and to the vast, unexplored continent of Australia. The Redcoat era, while far from over, would find new battlefields far from the tobacco fields of Virginia. For the victors, the world was remade. The United States was born, a republic built on the battlefield of Yorktown. The French monarchy, led by men like Rochambeau and Lafayette, had achieved its revenge for the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. But in doing so, it had bankrupted itself and exposed its own soldiers to the dangerous, intoxicating ideas of liberty and revolution. Ideas that would, within a decade, come home to consume them in their own firestorm. But all that was in the future. For the men who stood on that Virginia field on October 19, 1781, the moment was simpler and more profound. It was the end. For the British soldier of the 33rd or 71st Regiment, it was the humiliation of defeat and the relief of survival. For the American Continental, it was the stunning, unbelievable realization that they had actually won. For the French professional, it was the satisfaction of a siege perfectly executed. It was the final nail in the coffin, the catastrophic surrender that proved to be the decisive stroke. It was, in every sense, the day Britain lost America. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.